Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. As the Chinese proverb goes, may you live in interesting times. And in news terms, the last year has certainly been interesting. From the Arab Spring to Russia's unprecedented opposition protests, the ongoing fighting in Syria, and even the London riots, one thing these events share is the impact social media have had on them. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, blogs and others have been called catalysts for social change. So what impact are they having? And are we overestimating the impact of social media at the expense of more old-fashioned activism and even traditional media? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Jonathan Lee. He's a lawyer and blogger, and he's written on the uses of social media. Mark Pack is head of digital at the consultancy firm MHP Communications and a blogger who's written on social media and the Arab Spring. Dr. Andy Williamson is a Hansard Society fellow. He's researched digital democracy and the uses of social media. And from Moscow, I'm joined by Peter Lekharov. He's a Voice of Russia host there, and he presents a program on internet trends. Peter, let me come to you first. Obviously, we've seen the recent opposition protests in Russia. I think regular listeners of The Voice of Russia will be familiar with them. But how important have social media been in helping the opposition movement there to organize?
Well, pretty much the protests right now, this 3rd December, they were organized only through social networks, and hence some media even call these Facebook protests. So traditionally, protests or oppositions, rallies and meetings and events of this kind, they had very little people attending them in Russia, at least in the past few years. But now these Facebook protests, as they were called, they were really massive and people gathered. So it was clear that not political organizations organized it through regular means, but users through social networks, they gathered. It appears that a certain sentiment in these people reached a critical point, a boiling point, and the people, instead of spreading the sentiment through social networks as they usually do, just talk to each other on all things whatsoever, including politics, well, they decided that they had enough, and they took it to streets to make sure that their voice is heard. Because, frankly, traditional media and the social media are two completely different mediums here in Russia. What you see in newspapers, on television, on radio, and what you read in social networks, these are two completely different things, for better or worse. This is just the state of things currently are.
There's a lot of criticism of the Russian media, particularly the state media, and it's often said that the state media lack objectivity when it comes to politics. Our social media, is the internet then seen as being much more crucial as a method of getting objective information out there?
Well, this is also a point for discussion. Define objective, because basically on the internet, everyone is a reporter, everyone is a journalist, everyone is a publishing house, media channel. You have a cell phone, you have your own channel on YouTube, right? And this also poses several problems like lack of accountability, lack of control, and lack of moderation. Basically, you can make sure that your message is heard by everyone, but the problem is nobody knows if your message is true or false. So this is what happened. People usually say that they've shot some videos at the polling stations, ballot stuffing. The traditional media, in turn, said, and the authorities, that these videos were fabricated. They were fake. And with the current state of things, basically, it's impossible to say if these videos indeed were fake or not. But the problem with social networks is that the most active part of the Russian society, people in their early 20s, early 30s, more successful usually, the ones that can afford internet connection. This is especially apparent in regions, out of Moscow and St. Petersburg, where everyone usually has this. Anyway, the most active part of the Russian society who also happens to use internet, well, they have this stereotype that the government is always wrong. They have a stereotype that the traditional media is always wrong, and hence they tend to believe everything that the oppositionist inclined bloggers and independent internet media say. This is a split in opinion between the pro-governmental and anti-governmental people in Russia, and it goes along the lines of internet users, basically. Everyone who uses social networks are set against the government, regardless of it being true or not.
Mark Pack, if I can come to you. I mean, you've written widely about the Arab Spring. Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, obviously the big one. Media were a big part of what happened there. But I think you could argue that actually the traditional media, the broadcast media, television in particular, perhaps had more influence than social media there. What would you say?
Certainly, I think that's right, that you can't really disentangle the effect of social media from the impact of Al Jazeera. Having a rolling TV news programme being beamed into a whole set of countries across the Middle East with a fairly independent editorial line in most of those countries, I think was really important in both providing people with a way of finding out what was going on in the country, but also an incentive to provide information, because people knew that if they managed to capture something on YouTube or upload a photo to the internet, it wouldn't just be an immediate audience on social media for it, but via Al Jazeera it would get to a broad audience. And there was a very close and effective sort of feedback loop between social media and TV. Having said that, we shouldn't overplay the role of communications technology, because really the big factor was the huge increase in food prices in the year running up to the outbreak of the Arab Spring. But when you do have that sense of sort of social and economic pressure, that's when technology can then kick in and turn that from discontent into revolution.
Peter Lecarve raised an interesting point there, which is, okay, the technology makes it easier to share information, which is what you've just talked about as well. But in terms of journalistically, how that information is then actually authenticated, I mean, how do we know what we see or what we hear or what we read on the internet is actually accurate?
It's a big problem. I think if you take the example of Syria at the moment, and you look at the controversy over who was really behind certain bomb explosions, whether it was the opposition or the government trying to smear the opposition, quite possibly we'll never know the truth behind that. On the other hand, the sheer volume of information that has come out from Syria documenting in some way or other bloodshed makes it very clear that a very bloody crackdown is taking place. So although with lots of individual stories we might not quite be sure what's going on, what it does do is it does tell the overall story.
And could something like the Arab Spring have happened without social networking?
And revolutions happened before social media came along, happened before the internet came along. Revolutions even happened before electricity came along. So in one way, the answer is yes. Clearly, they could take place anyway. But I think if you look at several of the recent examples, there's a reasonable case to make that without social media, they probably wouldn't have happened. And maybe at some later date, dictatorship would have fallen. But particularly if you look at what has happened in the Philippines, perhaps the first country to see a president ousted by social media and the like, you can point to protests that were taking place which were looking like they probably wouldn't take off until the technology angle kicked in.
Jonathan Lee, in terms of looking at social media and its impact on politics, are we looking really at a fundamental shift that's taken place?
Yeah, that's my belief. I'm always particularly staggered why traditional elites and politicians haven't really grasped and got hold of these networks themselves and started communicating with people, from listening to responding to working out how best to use these for their own goals. I mean, they have arguably back in 2008 with President Obama. But yeah, I think the traditional broadcast media is almost like a secondary source of information now. People far more trust and rely on information that comes from what they see as primary sources, from bloggers, from individuals, anyone. I mean, an example this morning, there was the big American GM crop people, Monsanto.
Monsanto.
Yeah,
yes.
There's been a massive campaign online against them, particularly on their own Facebook page in the last few weeks, which I wasn't aware of, but just heard the example. And one of the main instigators in that was an 11-year-old who posted a video about them online, and this got spread all over the internet. So you can't pinpoint who the main people necessarily are. Just the crowd comes together, and people, whether their information is right or wrong, people latch onto that far more than a traditional, controlled, organised, structured broadcaster, where people are far more suspicious that they're not necessarily being told the truth. They're not getting an authentic voice.
It raises an interesting point, though, because what you're talking about there, which is the sort of increasing the space for activism, on the one hand, I think many people would agree with that. On the other hand, is there a danger that more sort of traditional forms of activism actually could be endangered by online activism? Because, for example, I think we're all probably familiar with looking at our Facebook pages and seeing petitions for, stopping homophobia in Uganda, or petitions for this, petitions for that. But I think many people would argue that sort of feet on the ground activism, old-fashioned activism, is still something that needs ultimately to be done.
Yeah, I think in many cases they're almost in some ways synonymous now, but I think it's the it's the online connectivity and network density, which is a word used by Brian Solis, that we didn't really have as societies before. That drives the offline behaviour, the behaviour of in the example of Egypt and all the crowds coming on the streets. Yes, Al Jazeera was maybe, and the traditional broadcasters were maybe were a factor, but they were again effectively reporting what was being instigated and driven by the crowd, a mass of people speaking their own mind and their own opinions and telling people how they see it, and if the crowd likes that, then it takes off, no matter who you are.
Andy Williamson, in terms of the impact of social media, I mean, we're looking at this in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Russia, elsewhere. There is this sort of game of almost cat and mouse between the protesters and the authorities, on the other hand, isn't there?
Yes, we've seen some really good examples of where the authorities have not been able to keep up. The opposition, if you like, or the people that are fighting for change, have taken the lead. We've seen that in Egypt, where they've used social media tools to plan. And then what we've seen is the authorities come back. In Egypt, they came back and blocked it. In the UK, around the UK student riots and the England riots in August last year, we saw how social media tools were being used to organise people to be in the right place to cause a riot and cause a disturbance of the peace. Although they were different tools, they were more locked down. Again, we saw the authorities, in this case the police, totally unable to understand what was going on and constantly on the back foot. And we saw that from politicians as well. Knee-jerk reaction, blame Twitter, blame Facebook. Don't blame deep-seated economic crisis or social woes. Let's blame the tools at hand because we don't understand them. They must be wrong.
Definitely want to talk more about the London riots in a moment, but let me just ask you as well. Social media are essentially also a two-edged sword, though, because it makes it much easier for the authorities to be able to monitor what protesters, what activists are doing, presumably if it's all online.
You have to assume that if you're doing something on social media, someone is watching you, someone is listening to what you're saying, and they are looking for ways to counter what you're doing. The beauty of social media is the virality of the network, the ability to get a message out to a lot of people through a lot of connections very quickly. Well, the converse of that is you can then track it. It's public. BlackBerry messaging is the exception to that because obviously it's a collective communication tool that's encrypted. So there are some challenges there, but they'll be overcome.
Peter Lekarev, do you think that we are at risk of sort of overdoing it when it comes to social media in terms of overestimating what impact it's having?
Well, basically, I agree that social media is an excellent tool to get your message heard, and I would like to pose a point, emphasize a point that social media, in my opinion, is just that, a tool. It's not a basically people are making social media this boogeyman that provoked the Arab Spring, basically provoked massive protests and riots and even revolutions. Well, I think basically social media as an umbrella term is just a new plane of interaction. Like before, people had to interact they talked with each other in person. Then they had phones and mails. Then they had emails. Then they had bulletin boards or forums. And now they have social media. Basically, it's just a new way to people to organize themselves, to talk to each other. And if there is nothing there, there is no sentiment, there is no feeling that can be brought into motion by this human interaction. No amount of talking through social networks or any other means will make people go to streets. What I want to say is unless people really feel strongly about something, regardless of what kind of tool they use to send a message, they're not supported. In other words, if people in Syria or in Egypt did not want to go to streets and protest and put their lives at risk by clashing with the authorities, they would not do it regardless. Was it social media, or they called each other, or they mailed each other, just met in person in underground clubs. This would not happen if it were not their true belief in the idea.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing social media and their impact on political protest with my guests Jonathan Lee, Mark Pack, Andy Williamson and Peter Lekarev. Mark Pack, you've referred to the cute cat theory of censorship in terms of way of describing how different approaches of how authorities have tried to deal with online protests. Can you just elaborate a bit on that?
It picks up on